Welcome to chapter 9. So this is on how we manage the memory system and the memory space of a process. So here is the outline of this lecture. So we'll start with background. So there are two ways that memory is allocated in modern operating systems. So we have contiguous memory allocation and we have paging. So then we will discuss the structure of the page table, some page swapping algorithms. And finally, we'll discuss a few real-world examples that include the Intel architectures and the ARM architecture. So the objectives are to provide a detailed description of the various ways that memory is organized in modern hardware, to discuss various memory management techniques, to provide a detailed description of the Intel Pentium processor, which supports both pure segmentation and segmentation along with paging. So this is a very important mechanism in x86. So now let's come to the background. So a program must be brought from disk into memory and placed within a process for it to run. Alright. So it will clearly access some memory and it will access the registers. So the registers are private to the CPU, so there is no issue. But the memory unit of the CPU will see a sequence of addresses which either they may be read requests or they may be write requests. If it is a write request, then data also needs to be supplied. So register accesses are fast. So the main memory of course can take many cycles and the cache sits between the CPU and the main memory. So the caches are not visible to the operating system. So caches by definition are not visible to the operating system or anybody else. There are a few instructions to flush caches, but that is a special case. In general, as far as the CPU is concerned, the memory system is just an array of bytes. This internally can of course be divided between different levels of caches and the memory itself. But that said and done, think of this as a special case. And think of the memory the way the CPU or the program sees it as just as a large linear array of bytes. And needless to say, if multiple processes are running, we need some degree of protection and isolation. Otherwise, one process can see the data written by another process and essentially run away with its data. Protection. So we need to censure or stop a process from accessing addresses that belong to other processes. So one of the old methods of doing it, so mind you, this is quite old, a variant of it is there in modern x86 processors. Nevertheless, the method is old. So one of these methods is that we contiguously allocate the memory of a process. We know how much memory is going to use. We provide it a base address. So let's say the address is 10, we add the real address is base plus 10. And we constrain the process to only access the addresses between base and base plus limit. That's it. Which basically means that a process knowingly or unknowingly will not be able to exceed the boundaries of its address space and access addresses in another process's address space. This will not be possible. Alright, so this is something that will definitely not be possible in this case. So the base and base plus limit idea is old and is unfortunately not something that happens today. But as I said, a remnant of it is there. We'll discuss the remnant later. So the basic idea is, given a CPU address, we can either add it to the base, or if it's an absolute address, we check it with respect to the base. If it is greater than or equal to the base, yes, but it needs to be less than the base plus limit. Then we access memory, otherwise we don't. The instructions to load the base and limit registers are clearly privileged, which means that they can only be executed by the operating system and by nobody else. Okay, so that's an important point to bear in mind, that it's only the operating system that can change the base and address registers and nobody else. And this is mainly because security is involved, particularly the security of the same program and the security of other programs. So now the question is, how do we do address binding? So programs on the disk which are ready to be brought into memory will execute from an input queue, a scheduler queue or whatever. So without support, so let's consider a very basic system such as the Arduino processor that doesn't even have an operating system. So without any support, the program will start from address 0 and all addresses will be absolute. It's a bad idea, but in extremely simple IoT kind of systems, it's there. Of course, this is a bad idea. The reasons are that, so you need to look at this, that two programs, of course, you can't run one after the other, even in a context switching mode. You clearly can't run them in parallel, because if let's say both want to write to address 0, what will happen? They'll overwrite each other's data. So the addresses are represented in different ways in different stages of a program's life. So when you are writing source code, our addresses are usually symbolic, unless of course we are into pointer manipulation, which means that we define local variables, global variables, static variables, so they are symbolic. So we are not specifying addresses. It is the job of the compiler to bind our variables to what are called relocatable addresses, which basically means they are with respect to some pointer, like maybe with respect to the stack pointer. So we can say 14 bytes, 20 bytes, 24 bytes with respect to the stack pointer or the base pointer or frame pointer. So they are always with respect to some value stored in some registers. That's considered relocatable address. The linker or the loader. So linker is basically something that takes all the object files and produces the binary, and the loader is a program that takes the binary and actually loads it in address space such that it can be run, loads it in memory such that it can be run. They can then convert these relative addresses to absolute addresses, in the sense that if all our addresses are with respect to the stack pointer or with respect to some other register that indicates the beginning of the heap area, then who sets the value of these registers, right? So basically that can be the job of the linker, that when you are producing your final executable, you set the value of these registers. Or what can happen is that you leave the value of these registers unassigned, but when the operating system loader is starting the program, it can set the value of, let's say, the stack pointer register, and then all the addresses within the program will be with respect to this. So this, you can think of this as a runtime, just like a pre-load time address setting, where the program still has relative addresses. They become absolute when the program starts to run. So each binding essentially is mapping from one address space to the other, let's say from the symbolic address space to the relocatable address space, from the source code to the compiler, and from then there to absolute. So this is again a summary of the previous slide, where we are looking at compile time, load time, and execution time address binding. So in general, unless you are looking at really serious C code or assembly code, we are almost never dealing with absolute addresses. It's absolute code is almost never generated. We compile the code, and then at load time, the relocatable code that is there, that is made absolute by setting the values of the registers which we have left unspecified at compile time. Sometimes even at execution time, the binding can be delayed until runtime. For example, let's say the process can be moved, or for other reasons which we shall see later, which involve security. Sometimes even after loading, until the program doesn't physically run, the addresses are not completely determined. In addition, if you are using the base limit idea, the base and limit register idea, which as I said is dated, you would need some hardware support. At least you would need those base and limit registers. So this again summarizes the basic idea, which is fairly simple stuff. It has been covered earlier as well, that we have a source program. It goes through the compiler or assembler. It's compiled. Then what is produced is an object module. An object module is a .o file, and the source is, let's say, .c file. There are other object modules, other .o files, DLL files, let's say .so in Linux for shared object, .dll in Windows. They can either be statically linked or what we shall see dynamically linked, but let's consider static linking for the time being. We link all of them, we take all of them, make one large binary. This binary is of course lying on that hard disk. So this is copied to memory. A memory region is created that contains the code. And then of course the way you execute it is that the loader over here will first copy it, will also link it with other system level libraries. And finally the in-memory binary image, prior to loading it, will set the program counter value to the first instruction in this image, and subsequently the program will execute. And as we have seen, for a program to exit, it needs to actually call the exit function. Okay, so then we also have the idea of dynamic linking, which we will discuss. Recall that dynamic linking was a case where all the libraries are not statically linked. Instead, if there is a certain function like printf, you have a stub function for printf. All that it does is it locates the DLL, reads the code of printf, brings it into the, so this happens for the first time, first invocation. It brings the code of printf into the address space of the process, and then it calls the printf via a function pointer mechanism. The second time that we call printf, the DLL doesn't have to be reloaded. You have already loaded it, so you directly jump to the location and you execute and you come back. So what we are currently looking at is that we are looking at a complex process where the programmer sees an extremely easy high-level model. Starting from the C program or Python program, doesn't matter, to the object code, the addresses undergo several levels of translation. Finally, an address is presented to the CPU. So this address that is presented is referred to as the logical or virtual address, and we shall see that there is a reason that the addresses that are used in compile time or even load time address binding, they need to differ from the actual address that the memory system sees, which is the physical address. So the logical address space and the physical, so logical address space is the last address which essentially is coming from the runtime system, whatever it may be. So a simple runtime system that we have seen is that the loader loads all the code into memory and starts executing from there. So in this case, all the addresses are already hard coded in the code. So these for us are virtual addresses because these addresses are actually sent to the CPU. So what we are arguing is that this is not enough. Even though you have seen a process of address translation, this is not enough. The primary reason being that nothing stops us from running two copies of the program, either at the same time on different cores or on the same core in a time multiplex fashion. Both of them will have the same set of addresses. And if let's say they access address 5 and address 5, well, 5 is a bad number, should be a multiple of 4 if 4 is the word size. So I stand corrected, let's make it 8. If both of them access address 8, then there is a problem, they may conflict. So because of the conflict, needless to say, it is problematic. It can lead to errors in the execution as well as it can lead to one process stealing the data of another process. So that's why the address that is presented to the CPU needs to undergo a translation. So think of this as a memory management subsystem. So this is a simple piece of hardware and software, but it's traditionally referred to as the MMU. The MMU as such doesn't exist. It's a virtual concept because it contains, as we will discuss in the next few slides, few independent hardware and software entities. Nevertheless, MMU is an old term, so let's go on with it. But we will of course break it down and discuss particular subcomponents. So the logical address, as far as we are concerned, is something that comes out as a result of compilation, linking and loading. But still it doesn't stop us, it doesn't avoid security problems because you can run two copies of the same process, they will access the same address and then you'll have havoc. So to ensure that these are genuinely separate physical addresses, where there is no possibility of an overlap unless intended to be so, we need to have a translation process that explicitly ensures this. Many methods are possible. So let's start with a simple scheme. Let's call the base register, the same base limit register, let's call the base register as the relocation register. The value in the relocation register will be added to every address generated by the user process. So in this case, the real address is the address generated by the user process plus the contents of the base register, which in this case we are calling the relocation register. The user program will consequently only deal with logical addresses. It will not see the real addresses. Execution time and execution time binding will occur, where the real address will be generated at the time of execution. So what are we doing? As a part of this scheme, the logical address will be added to the relocation register, and then the physical address will be the relocation register's contents plus 346, which in this case was the logical address. Fine. So if, let's say, what we can do is that we can have separate bases and limits, so then we can constrain every process to work within its base and limit, assuming the memory access behavior of a process is known and furthermore it's extremely well behaved. This idea will work. So this is how many ancient systems, old systems used to work. Now of course they don't work in that way. They work differently. So now let's come to dynamic loading. So this was static, the entire process. So dynamic loading is essentially dynamically loaded libraries where the entire program does not need to be in memory to execute. So let's say a lot of functions, libraries are not loaded until they are invoked, they are called. So this of course reduces the size of the dynamic footprint of the program. For example, in a C library you can have thousands of functions. So if you link all of them, all their code will come into the binary, not required. So if you are calling only two, only those two will come, but we don't know which two they are, so we wait for runtime. All the routines which are kept on disk are in a relocatable format, which basically means that we never call a function with its absolute address. Instead, what we do is that, let's say if we are calling printf, printf is basically an offset with respect to some known register. So we call that address, and as we have discussed in the past, this actually for the first time it's called loads the code of printf into the address space. That again is space. So at runtime it could be an absolute address, or it could again be a relative address with respect to this space. So this is useful when large amounts of code are needed to handle infrequently occurring cases. There is no special support as such from the operating system that is required. This is implemented in the program itself. OS can of course aid and assist this process by providing libraries to implement dynamic loading, but again it's not required. Static linking, on the other hand, is where everything is combined at compile time, but dynamic linking, as we have just seen, is done at execution time, where a small piece of code known as a stub is used to locate the library. So you can always use the LDD call in Linux to find out where the library is. The stub will replace itself or add an indirect to the address of the routine once it's loaded. The operating system will add it to the address space of the processor. The address space of the process after a system call is made. And as we have discussed, dynamic linking is particularly useful in the case of shared libraries. So if we are talking of contiguous allocation, the main memory has to support both user OS and user processes. And since the main memory is a limited resource, it needs to be allocated efficiently. So what is normally done in such contiguous allocations with this base and base limit register idea is that we just partition the main memory, right? So we just partition it. So we just partition it. OS becomes kind of one process. This becomes process 1, process 2. OS can either be in high memory, which means the highest addresses, or it can be in low memory, which is the lowest addresses. So that depends, that varies with systems. So this is what I am describing is an old way of implementing, of partitioning the address space among a set of processes, the OS being one of them. and each process is allocated a continuous chunk of memory. So the relocation, the base limit registers in this case constrain the range of logical addresses, and they limit what each process is allowed to access. So this enforces a separation. And given that the MMU assigns physical addresses to logical addresses dynamically, it can allow actions such as changing the kernel size or something if it is possible to extend the region, but this is where there is a problem. Let us say that for a given process you allocate maybe 1 MB. It turns out that it needs 2 MB, but there is no space because the other contiguous regions are taken by other processes. Then there is a problem, right? You could have memory space that is free in other regions of main memory, but if it's not contiguously available, then there is an issue. So this of course is a huge problem with the base and limit idea, where so we have seen different variants of this diagram before. I'm not getting into it, where of course you check the address, add it to the relocation and register and generate the physical address. So main problem is that, how do you deal with partitions? How do you manage memory? So this to us seems to be a difficult problem. That's the reason it's not used. But that said and done, there are still some examples, some situations within the kernel where you would like to do it, but this discussion is better deferred slightly towards the future. So if you have variable partition sizes for efficiency, where each partition is sized for a given process, that is definitely what you need, but the sizes you may not, the catch is that you may not know the sizes of these partitions a priori. So what could happen is that you would end up with holes which are blocks of available memory that are otherwise not assigned, unused, and they can be throughout the memory space. So, like look at this. So you could have process 5, 8 and 2, 8 could then die. So this entire region could be a hole. Process 9 could fit in here, and then process 5 could then die. So then you'll have 2 holes created over here. It's possible that the next process will not fit in any of these holes, but you still have enough memory for the next process. It's just because of this constraint that you want all the memory to be contiguously allocated, you will not be able to allocate memory from the blue regions. So let's look at how you would operate in this fashion, which is clearly not optimal, but it's a good starting point. So when a process arrives, it is allocated memory from a hole which is large enough to accommodate it, one of the blue regions. And any process that is exiting, it frees its partition, frees the region that it has. And let's say it merges it with other neighboring partitions if they are also free. So the operating system will maintain 2 data structures. One is allocated partitions and other is free partitions, which are essentially the list of these holes. So let's say a new request comes whose size is n. So how do we fit it? Because it is possible that in a large memory, you might have some region for a process, then you could have a hole, then another region for another process. You could have tons of allocated regions and holes, right? So one is first fit. So you start scanning, let's say from the left, lower to higher addresses, find the first hole that is big enough. Other is best fit. So first fit, well, you can have the list of holes as a linked list and traverse the linked list. The only problem is in the worst case, it could take order and time. Alright. The other is that you could maybe have a priority queue, which is useful in the next one of these holes. So you find the smallest hole that is big enough to hold the that is big enough to essentially hold the block. So to see, the priority queue is actually good for the first one, but again this will priority queue will actually give you the minimum, and the minimum might be smaller than the size of the block. So that's the reason for the first fit, a linked list is probably a better choice. For the second one, the data structure of choice could be a sorted binary tree, a balanced sorted binary tree, a BST, a binary search tree. So in this case, what you could do is you could start from the root and find the root, find the node that is the closest, the best fit. Or you could do the worst fit. In this case, the worst fit would clearly be a priority queue which stores the maximum, the largest possible size of the hole. And then you put the block in there. So there is no need to search the entire list, but essentially choosing the correct data structure for each of these mechanisms such that the process can be allocated memory based on these heuristics. Choosing the data structure is a bit of a challenge. So there is, of course, there is a competition between a tree, a normal queue, a priority queue, a hashing structure. There can be a lot of data structures, and of course a linked list, right? There can be a lot of structures that could compete, but they would have different worst case complexities. So in general, first fit and best fit are seen to be better than worst fit in terms of both storage utilization as well as speed. So you could be wasting memory in two possible ways. They are known as external fragmentation and internal fragmentation. So in external fragmentation, what happens is, it is similar to the example that I showed, where the total memory space does exist to satisfy a request, but it is not contiguous. So this means that if my memory is like this, I have a sequence of allocated regions, alright, and a sequence of free regions, of course. So it is possible that I might need this much of memory. It is clearly there, but it is not contiguous, hence I cannot allocate. Internal fragmentation is that the memory that has been allocated to a process may be slightly larger than what the process actually needs. So let's say the process needs 80 MB and maybe we allocated it 100 MB. So in this case, 20 megabytes has been allocated, but the process is not going to require it. So this is an example of internal fragmentation. So if you're looking at the first fit analysis, it can be theoretically proven that if there are n blocks allocated, half n by 2 blocks will be lost to fragmentation, 1/3 may be unusable. There is known as the 50% rule. So you will see many similar mathematical results for best fit, worst fit, first fit. So in the late 70s, early 70s, this used to be a fairly active area of research, but ever since virtual memory has come, this area has kind of become outdated. So that's the reason I am also not going into this in great detail. So of course, for external fragmentation, what needs to be done is that you need to do compaction, in the sense you need to shuffle the contents, merge, basically physically move the processes. Only if there are no absolute addresses, everything is relative, then only the process's memory space can be moved. But if there are absolute addresses, that cannot be done, right? So movement is not possible. And furthermore, it is possible that you would have outstanding IO requests. So when they come back, they would want to write to the old address, but the process might not exist at the old address anymore. And so of course those complexities are there. So one solution that the book is proposing is that, well, you try to break down the activity. Any IO activity happens from OS buffers, and later on you transfer the data from OS buffers to user level buffers. Fair enough, this seems to be a difficult task, especially moving a lot of processes, the memory spaces of processes around to create a hole that is large enough to fit the incoming process. So even the hard disk will have similar problems if we decide to allocate hard disk blocks in this fashion. Consequently, this base limit based idea has not really survived the test of time. What has survived is something called paging, which completely avoids external fragmentation. There could be internal fragmentation though, but that's not much of a concern. So the physical address space of a process, furthermore, can also be non-contiguous. So if you look at it, if you look at the memory map of a process, then you have the text section which is at the bottom, let's say from address 0. So I deliberately kept a space because you could have some other data before the text section. Then you could have your heap section which kind of grows up, and you would have your stack section that grows down. And if it's a 64-bit process, this could be huge. So this could be address 0 and this could be like address 2 to the power 62. Okay. So given that there is a lot of non-contiguity in this, the previous approach that we have seen with base and base limit registers is simply not possible. So what we do is that we don't divide memory into variable sized memory chunks, we divide them into fixed size memory blocks, where a block can be anywhere between 512 bytes to 16 megabytes, 4 KB being the most common. So we divide logical memory into blocks of the same size called pages. Similarly, we divide physical memory into the same size, also call them frames. Frames are often referred to as physical pages, but we will use the term page and frame. To run a program whose size is n pages, we need to find n free frames and load the program. So what do? Well, you break down the address space into pages. So let's say there are 1, 2, 3 pages required here. Maybe you require 2 pages here and maybe you require 1 page here. So let's say if there are n pages, what we do is we find n frames in memory and just map the pages to frames. So it doesn't matter how we map them, it is simply irrelevant. But as I said, we break the virtual address space, break the physical address space and map a page to a frame. And we set up a software data structure called a page table that essentially maps pages to frames. And each page or frame is 4 kilobytes, which is fairly large. So as I said, we could have internal fragmentation if you are not using all of those 4 kilobytes, but we don't care because given all the problems that it solves, this is a pretty minor issue. And similarly, we could do the same with the hard disk and so on, but we will discuss that later. We can still have the problem of internal fragmentation, which we blissfully ignored. Alright. And so in this case, what we are basically doing is we have forsaken the idea of variable sized memory chunks. We are only looking at fixed size chunks where you have 4 KB chunks in both physical and the virtual address space. And we just map a page to a frame. And even though the pages may be contiguous, the frames need not be. So as you can see from this mapping, the frames need not be contiguous. They can be absolutely in a haphazard fashion. We don't care. Because anytime we access a page, the virtual address goes to the MMU. The page table is one of the components of the MMU that translates the virtual address to a physical address. From there we go to the physical frame and we access it. How do caches come into the picture? Well, as far as we are concerned, after the address has been translated, it goes to the memory system. The memory system could only have main memory, could have a hierarchy of caches, it doesn't matter. We only look at the memory system as one unified whole. The basic address translation scheme is like this, that the address that the CPU generates is divided into two parts. So we consider the page number P to be the first m-n bits, and the page offset, which is the address of the byte within the page, is the remaining part, the n bits. So the page offset will clearly remain the same between the physical address and the virtual address, but the page number will be mapped to an equivalent frame number. So for a given logical address space and page size n, this is the way that we would actually divide. Right? So the page number is what will undergo mapping and the page offset will remain the same. So what we do is that the address that the CPU generates will have these two components. So as you can see, the offset remains the same, but the page ID is used to access the page table. So we will look at how that is designed. But let's say if it's a linear array where for all possible page IDs we have one entry, which is extremely inefficient, but let's assume it is so, conceptually at least. Then at the pth entry you'll have the frame number. The frame number is then used to construct the physical address, and the physical address is subsequently used to access the frame. And within the frame we basically walk d bytes, assuming this is the start of the frame and this is the end of the frame. So we walk d bytes, and that is the start of whatever we would like to read. If it's a byte level access, we read 1 byte. If it's a word level access, we read 4 bytes or 8 bytes. So the model of paging is something like this, that let's say if these are our 4 pages, then the 4 pages can be mapped to different points within the physical memory, and the frames need not be contiguous. So if you can see, this gives us an immediate advantage that for 2 processes they would have 2 separate page tables. So mind you, you have a page table per process, and the other page table can map to a different set of frames, so there is no overlap. So even unintentionally, it is not possible for one process to access the physical frames of another process. So this even unintentionally is not possible. Alright. And furthermore, external fragmentation is not possible, because if there are free frames, they can always be mapped to. An example of a paging, if I use a page size of 4 bytes and a physical memory of 32 bytes, let's say 8 pages. So well, if these are my 4 bytes within a page, then as you can see, they are mapped to this point over here. Well, that's not very hard to see, because this is being mapped to the 5th frame, and this is 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th. So the beginning of the 5th frame is over here. So this pretty much gets mapped here. Similarly, as you can see, the first one, EFGH, is mapped to the 6th one, which is over here. So this is the way that any mapping would proceed, where you first map the page to a frame, and subsequently within the frame you use the offset bits to address the byte or the set of bytes within the frame. So now going to the next page, if you actually calculate the degree of internal fragmentation, because it is always possible that some amount of space within a frame may get wasted. So if the page size is, let's say, 2 KB and the process size is 72,766 bytes, so pretty much what we would do is we would require 35 pages plus an additional 1086 bytes, for which we would allocate one more page, which means that these many bytes would actually get wasted in the final page. But as I said, look, that's fine. We are wasting 962 bytes out of 72,766, which is okay. The worst case fragmentation is 1 frame minus 1 byte, and the average case fragmentation is half a frame size. But given the fact that most processes nowadays have massive memory footprints, this is okay. But of course, the argument could be that we should not have very large page and frame sizes. In a sense, we should not have 1 megabyte page and frame sizes, because that will complicate issues. And then the internal fragmentation would actually become huge, which is the expected value is half a frame size. So we shouldn't be doing that. So, but 4 KB has been found to be a good enough engineering choice, and there is no need per se to actually go beyond that. Alright. And furthermore, many operating systems, that includes Linux as well, Solaris for sure, they include 2 page sizes, 8 KB and 4 MB. So the 4 MB pages and even more are called huge pages. There is an advantage of having huge pages, which we will see. So I'll defer the answer to this question. It's much better if you figure it out, otherwise I will tell you. So the other question is that now, since the entire memory is being divided into frames, so we'll have many frames that are allotted and many frames that are free. So we need a frame manager. So we need some sort of a free frame list, and the data structure of the list should be designed in such a way that if we need a free frame, it will be very easy to go and fish it out from the list. That should be possible, right? That whenever we need a frame, we can immediately go there, find a free frame quickly and allocate that to a page. So for example, let's say there's a new process comes and it needs to allocate 4 pages, 0, 1, 2 and 3. Well, we can immediately find free frames for them and we can quickly allocate them. So it should be possible to do so quickly. So there are several ways that the page table in itself is implemented. So we have talked about 2 data structures. One is the page table, other is the free frame list. So the page table is normally kept in main memory because otherwise there will be issues, because then you'll have to page the page table. So the page table is typically pinned to main memory. So then the page table has a base register which points to the page table, and it has a length register which indicates the size of the page table, which means that you will not exceed it and walk out of it. So what we see is that this is an expensive mechanism walking the page table, which in its rawest form is essentially a list of virtual memory pages where we need to walk the list. So list can be made more efficient in the sense it can be organized as a binary search tree, for example. But in any case, we'll have to make a lot of accesses to main memory, which are expensive, and then find the mapping and use the mapping subsequently. So for every memory access, so we make one instruction memory access for every instruction. And furthermore, given that 30% of the instructions are loads and stores, we also access the data memory. So if, let's say, for each of them, if we need to walk the page table, that will represent a massive performance overhead, which is not something we are willing to pay, because typically we want to process 3 to 4 instructions per cycle, and for each of them, if we have to walk the page table, that is going to be a huge overhead. So this term is called traversing the page table is also called walking the page table. So this can be solved by actually having a small hardware cache known as a TLB. So because of temporal and spatial locality, if we have a small and ultra fast hardware cache that stores somewhere between 32 to 64 mappings, so it can clearly be accessed in one cycle, less than one cycle actually. So then we'll immediately get the mapping. Subsequently, what can be done is that the hardware cache, so the hardware cache, of course, if you miss in the TLB, we'll have to go to the page table, but TLB hit rates are typically very high. So TLB hit rates are typically upwards of 98-99%. So most of the time we'll hit in the TLB, primarily because each entry in the TLB represents 4 KB of memory space. So because of temporal and spatial locality, TLB misses are rare, and hence most of the latencies of accessing a page table get hidden. Furthermore, so as we have discussed, by the way, that we have a separate page table for every process. Now a question can be asked, let's say we change the process. So one process gets context switched and a new process comes in. What happens to the TLB? So well, in this case, the entries of the TLB will be invalid. But what we could do is additionally, we could also store a part of the PID. It's also called an address space identifier along with each TLB entry, which will uniquely identify the process. So in this case, we need not flush the TLB upon every context switch. Instead, we just keep the TLB entries and we just allow them to get naturally evicted as and when the new process requires a new mapping. TLBs are small and fast, and they work primarily because of temporal and spatial locality. And as we have seen in other cases, replacement policies should be considered, in the sense if you have 32 entries and 32 mappings, basically a new mapping needs to come, which one do we throw out? There are different heuristics, we'll talk about them. And along with that, so along with the notion of the TLB, we should also discuss the design. So the design of the TLB is simple. It is basically an associative memory, which is well covered in courses on hardware and architecture, where we store the page number and the frame number. So whenever we are searching, we find if the page number exists. If it does, we just return the frame number. So what does the paging hardware look with TLB? Well, first we access the TLB with the page number. If we get the frame number, well, that is great. If we do not get the frame number, there's a TLB miss, then we access the page table. The page table can be accessed in two ways. So in many Intel systems, this is done automatically, in the sense that whenever a program's context changes, the address of the process, the address of the page table of the process is a part of the context. It is stored in the CR3 register. So the hardware will automatically walk the page tables. It knows the format. It will automatically walk the page table, figure out the mapping if there is there, and then it will find the mapping, populate the address and send it to physical memory, and along with that transfer the mapping to the TLB, the mapping that was read. There are other systems where if there is a TLB miss and interrupt is raised, then a dedicated TLB miss handler in the operating system actually takes care of the TLB miss. So both the paradigms are quite popular, a hardware approach and a software approach. So if you want to look at the effective access time, let's assume that the hit ratio is 80%. Suppose it takes 10 nanoseconds to access memory. So you find a desired page in the TLB, then the mapped memory access will take 10 nanoseconds. Otherwise, we will need 2 memory accesses, so let's assume it's 20 nanoseconds. So the effective access time is 0.8 into 10 plus 0.2 into 20, which follows from the standard formula of a weighted mean. So the net time is 12 nanoseconds. If we consider a more realistic hit ratio of 99%, then it will be 0.99 times 10 plus 0.01 times 20, where 20 is the time we are assuming it takes to access the page table. And that will take 10.1 nanoseconds. But typically when we are dealing with operating systems and so on, we don't do this kind of math because the interactions are fairly complicated, and also with modern out-of-order processors, many of these delays can actually get hidden, so we are not sure what is the critical path. Hence, such analysis actually have some academic value, but as such, they are not used. So they are not used in mainline operating systems work. So now let's come to the memory protection aspect of it. So what we can do is that we can, along with every page, every mapping, we can associate a bit which will say whether it's read only or read write or execute only. So for example, all our code pages could be marked as read only. Read only basically means that, let's say, a hacker is able to get control of the program. It cannot dynamically modify the program's code. That will not be possible, right? That is mainly because when it tries to actually modify the code of the program such that instead of doing what it is supposed to do, it does what the hacker tells it to do, this process will fail primarily because in the page table and the TLB, the code page is marked to be read only, which means the code page cannot change. Similarly, it is often the case that the hacker tries to divert the program counter to some part of the data memory and asks it to execute some code which was not an original part of the program. So in this case also, the paging hardware can have an additional execute bit which will be set to 1 for code pages. So in this case, if the execute bit is 0, even if the program counter is diverted over here by a hacker, what will happen is that the malicious code will not execute, because in the page table the execute bits permissions are set to 0. So these are different mechanisms via which protection is guaranteed or ensured by this particular mechanism. Alright, and then of course we'll have a valid invalid bit which to indicate if it's a valid mapping or an invalid mapping. So as I said, we can have a bunch of mappings, valid and invalid, and for example pages 6 and 7 don't point anywhere. So as far as we are concerned, this mapping is invalid. So now let's come to shared pages. So up till now we have been discussing the non-overlapping nature primarily of our code and data, that they are meant to be separate. But sometimes we don't want them to be separate, so we actually want the code to be shared. For example, consider, let's say, text editor like Notepad, and I'm just opening Notepad multiple times to edit different documents. You don't want separate codes, separate copies of the Notepad code to be made in memory. What you would want is that the same Notepad code is actually shared between different processes, because this code is not changing, right? So this is very easy to do. We just load the notepad code once in main memory, and then we just modify all the page tables of the processes such that their virtual addresses simply point to the physical addresses of the notepad code which is currently resident in main memory. So this is very similar to multiple threads sharing the address space. Furthermore, we have discussed a shared memory based IPC mechanism long back. So in this case, it is very easy. We take a shared frame. Okay, so let's call it a shared frame. We just modify the page tables and by implication the TLBs to contain an entry which maps a virtual address space of in process 1's address space to a frame here, and the same frame is again mapped by another virtual address in process 2's address space to the same frame. So this basically means that process 1, unbeknownst to it, it will just write to this address. Not unbeknownst, it would have made a SH open call before this, but it will write to these virtual addresses within its address space. Then magically those writes will start reflecting in process P2's address space because the physical frame is mapped to both. So this is not an inadvertent sharing. It is a deliberate sharing to create the shared memory IPC channel, and this does not rely on system calls. It is consequently very efficient. Okay, so consequently its efficiency is very high, and the reason for that primarily being that to transfer data between two processes, all that we do is we just use regular read and write, regular load and store instructions, and these load and store instructions are extremely fast and efficient. And just by using the virtual memory mechanism, we can share data between process 1 and process 2. And the rest of the code and data of each process is kept separate. Okay, is a separate copy of the code and data. It's kept separate. The pages for the private code and data can be anywhere in the address space of P1 and P2. It is only one or a couple of pages which are mapped, which are a part of the shared memory segment, explicitly for the purpose of IPC. So let's go through this example. So this example is basically showing you how shared memory is supposed to be done, shared pages. So in this case, we are sharing the pages of a library, because consider a generic library like the C library. There is no reason for us to create separate copies of it, because in any case, this piece of code is read-only. So what we do is that we just map them. The page table simply maps them to the same set of physical frames, which are 3, 4, 6 and 1, and essentially their page tables basically point to the same entry. And so this helps us save memory. The reason it helps us save memory is basically because we are not creating multiple copies of it, but the same copy in physical memory is just simply being mapped to different virtual address spaces. So what is the structure of a page table? Well, a page table can become fairly huge. Let's see how big. If we consider a 32-bit logical address space and the page size is 4 KB 2 raised to the power 12. So 4 KB is 2 raised to the power 12 bytes. Then the page table will have a million entries. Why? Because it's 2 raised to the power 32 by 2 raised to the power 12, which is 2 raised to the power 20, which is approximately a million. If each entry is 4 bytes, so we are talking of 4 MB of storage per process. Okay, this is important, per process. For just storing the page table. So if there are 100 processes, then we will require 400 megabytes, which is substantial. Right? In terms of memory usage, this is substantial, and we don't want to waste this much of memory in just storing page tables. So there are 3 ways of solving this such that we don't spend that much of memory storing page tables. One is hierarchical paging, hashed page tables and inverted page tables. So let's look at hierarchical paging, which is the most popular. So what we do is we break up the logical address space into multiple page tables. So a simple technique would be a two-level page table, where what we do is we have a primary page table. So this is called the primary or outer page table. So if you have a 32-bit address and the page size is 4 KB, so then these 12 bits signify the offset. The remaining 20 bits we can divide into 10 bits and 10 bits. We will use the upper 10 bits to address the primary page table. And the primary page table will have 2 raised to the power 10, which is 1024 entries. Okay. So why the upper 10 bits and why not the lower 10 bits? Well, the reason being that the degree of randomness in the lower bits will be much more. And in this case, we want to reduce the amount of randomness. And that will only come if we access the upper 10 bits. So why is this the case? Well, just count from 1 to 100. Right? So when you reach 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, so which position changes more, the units position or the tens position? You will find that the units position actually changes much more frequently. And that is why we use the upper bits to access this 1024 entry table. Furthermore, any entry for which any frame is mapped, so all of the entries, so there can be many entries that point to nothing, but a few of them will point to secondary page tables, right? And how many point is dependent upon the memory footprint of the program, but it's clearly not all. Only a few of the entries over here point to a set of secondary page tables. And so let's say that we map to this entry and then this points over here. Then what we can do is we can use the remaining 10 bits. So forget about the 1 to 500 that's written, and we can use the remaining 10 bits over here, and this will again have 1024 entries. Okay. So this can be used. So we can use the remaining 10 bits to address one of the rows over here. And once we address one of the rows over here, that will finally contain a mapping to the frame. So if you think about it, the size of this page table is actually not much. The reason being that most of the entries in the primary page table will actually be empty. We'll allocate space for them, but they will not point to any secondary page table. And only we'll have a few secondary page tables, not many. And those secondary page tables will require some space. So the total page space requirement is actually substantially lower, right? Significantly lower than what you would otherwise expect. So an example of two-level paging, as I said, we'll consider a 32-bit machine with, let's say, 1K page size, or example is for 4K page sizes. So let's do that. So the 4K page size, we'll have 12 bits for the page offset, and we'll have two entries P1 and P2. So for reasons discussed before, we will use P1 as an index for the primary or the outer page table, and we'll use P2 as an index for the inner page table. So the logic is that first we use P1, that points to one entry, that points to a secondary page table, then we use P2, and finally that points us to the frame. This is the frame, and then we use the displacement D to actually access the byte within the frame. And as I said, we will only have a few secondary page tables because many of these rows will be empty, they'll not point to anything, and consequently the space invested over here will be much lower. We can do the same for a 64-bit logical address space. Of course, in that scheme, if we have 12 bits, if D is equal to 12, we can split it as 10 for P2 and 42 for P1. Of course, if you have 42 per P1, it will have 2 raised to power 42 entries. So we clearly want to do better. Okay. And so clearly a two-level split for a 64-bit address space is not a good idea. Consequently, 64-bit address spaces have 3 or 4 level splits. So a 3-level paging scheme will break it into 10, 10 and 32. But normally we will also break this more. Okay, so this is 3 levels, but we might opt for 4 or 5 levels. Another approach in this space is called a hashed page table. So this is common in address spaces that are greater than 32 bits, like 64-bit address spaces. So in this case, the virtual page number is hashed using standard hashing algorithms into a page table entry. So this page table is actually a page table. It's an entry. It contains a chain of elements that hash to the same location. So you use a standard hash table where you use chaining. So one entry points to the next, and so on. So each of these elements will contain the virtual page number, the value of the mapped page frame, and a pointer to the next element. So each of these elements will have two fields, the virtual page number and the physical frame number. And of course, we traverse this list. If a match is found, we return it. Otherwise, we report the fact that there is no match in the page table. For 64-bit addresses, we can use clustered page tables. It's similar to hashed, but each entry would then refer to several pages, such as 16 pages instead of 1. So what we can do is we are essentially creating a degree of hierarchy over here, and this can be used for large sparse address spaces such as 64-bit address spaces, and this can be done. So a hashed page table, just to give an example the way that it's going to work, is that given the address P, we'll use a hash function. The hash function will point us towards a bucket. In the bucket, we will find a set of entries where every entry points to its next. If, let's say, find an entry whose virtual page number is P, let R be its physical page number, we'll then construct the physical address that will have its MSB bit set to R and the offset bit set to D. So that will be the physical address which will be used. The final design in this space is known as the inverted page table, which is that rather than each process having a separate page table and keeping track of all logical pages, why not have a single page table for all processes? So in this case, the single page table is actually a list of frames, right? And then we use a hashing engine to find the frame that the virtual page maps to. So each entry will consist of the virtual address of the page stored in that real memory location. So if multiple memory locations are mapping to the same frame, there will be multiple entries, right? So in this case, the search that is happening will still happen by the virtual address, but pretty much it will use some degree of hashing to find the frame. So this clearly decreases the memory that is needed to store each page table, but the amount of searching that you need to do to find an entry increases. Alright, but again TLBs can accelerate this process, so we are kind of insulated against the latency of this structure per se. Alright, but nevertheless, inverted page tables have their share of problems because they're indexed by the frame number and not the page number. So what you need to do is that given a page, use a hash and that will point you to an intermediate structure, and then the intermediate structure will then have a pointer to the frame. Then of course you can go to that entry within the frame and verify if an actual mapping exists or not. So the inverted page table architecture would look something like this, that for the CPU, you will actually look at the combination of the process ID, also known as the address space identifier, and the process, and the virtual page number. Then you will search within the inverted page table for the PID P pair. Alright. So the key idea of the search is that this can be implemented in various ways. So one way is that we have just one entry for each frame in memory, and then we use the PID P pair, we hash it, then we have another intermediate table where let's say it has one entry for the hash, which again makes it provides a pointer to the IPT or the inverted page table. Another way of designing it is that we have a page table that has a list of all PID P pairs, and then this we approach via hashing or via some other technique. And when we come here, we again search for the mapping. Okay. So this specific example does not take the second approach, it takes the first approach, where pretty much in the inverted page table we have one entry for each frame, and given a PID P pair, we either search for it linearly, in the sense we just keep on walking each of the entries till we find it, or we use a hashing to speed up things, which will require another auxiliary table to map to the entry. So regardless of how the data structure is created, if there is a match, finally we'll get a frame number, and the frame number will be used to construct the physical address. So we'll stop this lecture over here. In a subsequent lecture, we will discuss page replacement schemes as well as examples of different paging systems.